Um, I think the first thing to understand about January 6th is that the vote is a formality, right? The voters have gone to the polls, they've chosen their candidates, the states have certified the results, they've chosen their electors, the electors have voted, and then they send them on to Congress, and Congress validates those electoral votes. And again, it's just a formality, a lot of ceremony, but no drama, at least in a typical year. But of course, we knew that this year was not going to be a typical year just because Trump had not conceded. That hadn't happened in our lifetime, certainly. And then there were all these protests. So the ceremonial stuff was not going to begin until 1 o'clock, but we knew that there was going to be a lot of action beforehand. And so we got up there early, and I was just going back and looking at some of the pictures. I live near the Capitol, and as I was walking in across the lawn at around 9 o'clock, there were already protesters gathered on the East Lawn in front of between the Capitol and the Supreme Court. And a lot of them were, a lot of them looked like they had just come off a tour bus in Las Vegas. It would look like somebody's grandmother who was just sitting there in a lounge chair with the Trump flag planted in the lawn. It's January, so it's cold, so everybody's bundled up, but they did not look, menacing or threatening in any way. And then there were other groups of people who looked more serious. I don't want to say militant, but they looked more serious. They were dressed in military clothing. Some of them already had body armor at that hour. And some of them had radios, CB radios, transistor radios on their chests. And so as I'm walking in, I'm thinking, why would you need a transistor radio if you're just here to, to stand on the lawn and wave a Trump flag? And then as we got closer to the Capitol, as I got closer to the Capitol, there was you've heard these described as the bike rack gates. And these are they're probably 3 or 4 feet tall. And that was the only barrier separating that crowd from the Capitol. And as I walked through it, I had the ID, they were letting people through. And I turned back around, and for the first, I've been reporting in the Capitol for almost 20 years now, and for the first time, it just didn't look right. It didn't look like there was enough security for the crowd that was assembled even at 9 o'clock in the morning, and that was just going to grow. We knew. So I actually turned around at just looking at the photos at 9:17. I turned around and clicked a picture from the Capitol steps, looking back towards those fences and towards those crowds. And there was, a Capitol police officer maybe every 20 feet, 25 feet. There were no guns shown. Usually when there's a protest like that, or any protest around the Capitol, they've got dogs, they've got, guys with big AR type of guns. And there was just none of that show of force, which again seemed very unusual for the expectations of the day. So then we went inside, and again, the ceremony was not supposed to start until 1 o'clock, but there were guys walking around, and so we were milling around the House chamber. And the next thing that I recall was Jim Jordan, the very close Trump ally, very conservative, very pugnacious member, former head of the Freedom Caucus. And he was going into McCarthy's office, and we called him and we said, what's your expectation for the day? We know that there are going to be challenges in certain states. How many states is it going to be, and what would you like to see? And he said, the House is going to challenge 6 of these states. Right now, we only have senators who are going to back up 3 of them. He said, and his quote was, "But we're hoping for 6." So they were still lobbying senators to get the other 3. That was at about 10:20 in the morning. And then we were milling around up there a little later, and I got some pictures looking out of that. Right next to McCarthy's office, there's a big window between his office and the Ways and Means office, right off of the chamber floor on the 2nd floor there. And you can look out and again, looking on the East Lawn. And about noon, Scott and I were there just looking at it, and you could see the crowd was growing a little bit. But of course, this was all before this was all during Trump's speech. So much of the crowd was on the opposite side of the city at that point. They were on the west side, and they were at the White House. What we didn't know was that they were probably, a lot of them were already walking towards the Capitol at that point. let's see, I'm trying to think of the next thing. Oh, and at about 12:45, Josh Hawley, who of course was kind of leading the charge to protest the election results, was over on the House side. So he was clearly talking with, we don't know who he was talking to, but he stopped and talked to us for a little while, and he was clearly still lobbying House lawmakers to get more support. So there were a lot of conversations happening on the Republican side between House and Senate, between House leaders and rank and file. But there was no real expectation that anything terribly strange was going to happen. And then the next thing was at 1 o'clock, as expected, we went into Statuary Hall, which is just between the rotunda and the House chamber, and that's where Mike Pence was leading the senators who had they had those ceremonial wooden boxes that had the electoral votes in them, because those electoral votes are delivered to the Senate president. So the ceremony is that with the vice president, they walk them across the Capitol, they go to the House chamber, and then one by one, they certify the state results. So Pence walks by, the senators walk by. And then at that point, there were a number of reporters went up into the gallery to watch the actual votes on the floor. And we went back down into a space below, 2 floors below the House chamber, where just a press room that we've been working out of for a number of years. And we were watching it on C-SPAN, and Arizona was objected to as expected. Paul Gosar got up there and objected to it. So then the senators walked back across. We ran up and watched the senators walk back across the chamber again, and then we went back down. And there is and that was at 1:30, 1:45, something like that. Of course, the Capitol was breached at 2:11. And we could hear over the intercom that there were different announcements that were being made across the Capitol complex. At one point, one of the House buildings was locked down. Then it was all clear, and so there were different. You could tell that there were different things happening at different times. Again, there was never any sense that it was going to be what it became. But the next thing I recall was at about 2:20, so about 10 minutes after the protesters had also already entered the Capitol. There is because the room that we're in is underground, that level of the Capitol is underground. There's a huge skylight, and you can look up and you can see from underground, you can see the Capitol dome. And standing there looking at it, and you can never see people because you're not allowed to walk on the skylight, obviously. But suddenly there were a bunch of people walking across the skylight with Trump flags, and it was like a parade going across this thing. So that was kind of the first real sign that something terribly wrong was happening. And then from that same vantage point, you can look across towards the Senate side, through the CVC, through the Capitol Visitor Center, there's an enormous atrium underground there. And there was a single woman who was walking, older woman who was kind of walking. It's amazing there, lawmakers are getting lost all the time. We get lost all the time sometimes. But a single woman was walking, and there were some cops there, and they said, wait a minute, what's she doing? She's not supposed to be here. And so they arrested this woman. And as they're marching her away, she's screaming about the election being stolen and how patriots are here to save the day, type of thing. And it couldn't have been just a couple minutes after that 6, 7, 8 cops come flying down the stairs from the first floor, from the crypt, it's the first floor of the Capitol, just beneath the rotunda. And they come flying down the stairs, and there's debris and stuff being thrown at them. And we're standing there, Scott and I, again, beneath the skylight, and Scott was taping it, actually. And the cops turn and start running towards us, and they said, "Get the hell out of here." And we said, well, if the cops are running, then we should probably do the same thing. And we went back into the cave, which was just a short walk down. We call it the cave, which is the press room, just a short walk down the hall, which felt fine, because again, it's kind of an obscure part of the Capitol. It would take somebody either getting really lost, or just really lucky to come across us. We would be really unlucky in that case. But one thing that was concerning is that there was no lock on that door, and so there were 4 of us in that room for the next 6 hours or something like that, and we would, from time to time, we would wander out to see what was happening. Their protesters were coming in there. There were some arrests that we could see. There were also injured Capitol police officers who were being dragged down those same stairs and into that little cubby inside the Capitol Visitor Center. And every time we would go out there, they would just tell us, go back inside. It's not the place you want to be. You just get out of here. And some of them seemed to be pretty injured. I do remember one cop in the middle of 2 others, and it looked like, we thought he had been shot. It looked like he couldn't use his legs, so he was either unconscious or he'd been hurt in his lower half so much that he couldn't support his own weight. Another one came down the hallway. It was funny because I don't think the cops, aside from those that we would see from time to time outside there, I don't think they knew that anybody was in that room. And so periodically cops would come down the little hallway and be surprised to see us in there. And several times, then they would bring injured cops down into that hallway just because it was out of the way. One of them had been bear sprayed. And so one of the reporters that we were with, Emily from the Washington Times, was dumping water into his eyes to flush out his eyes. And a couple of times the cops said, we're going to Longworth, we're going to the office buildings, and if you want an escort, this is the time to do it. But of course, we were emailing with people who were already in the gallery and had been evacuated to Longworth. They were holding people in the Ways and Means room, and they felt trapped because they were in a secure place, but they weren't free to roam anywhere. And so at least we were in the Capitol, and we could maybe do some reporting on it. And so we all chose to stay, I think, kind of independently. And that's where we were for 6 hours. It was really at the end of it, it was just a sad experience, because this is, this was supposed to be not just like a temple of democracy, but it's our office. It's where we go to work every day, and it's where it's a symbol of something bigger than just the government. It's the country. It's the hopes of the country, and the peaceful transition of power has always been a part of that, a symbol of that. And what you learn is that symbols do matter. And of course, being down there, we didn't know the exact extent of it. Over the course of the next few weeks, the footage would start dribbling out, and then you hear the numbers. And we were not aware at the time that the protester, that Ashley Babbitt, had been shot, that there was a push to get into the speaker's lobby. For all the the CNN coverage from outside, we didn't know the extent of what was happening even a floor above us. So it's tough to go back into that mindset at the time, because we have been influenced by everything we have seen since. But it certainly did not seem, well, it's surreal and sad. It never felt scary, and I think that's only because we didn't know the extent to the extent of the violence that was happening very close to us. After everybody had left the building, and they weren't sure that everybody left the building, but it had to be 8-9 o'clock at night, maybe might have been later than that, might have been 10 o'clock or something, when we were finally allowed. They had come through with dogs, and they were looking for any stragglers who might have been left behind. And again, that building is very cavernous. There's a lot of obscure hallways and closets. There's lots of places to hide. So they brought dogs through to sniff around and make sure everybody was gone. Once that happened, we could roam around. And when we did, going up into the rotunda, and I remember standing up there just outside of Speaker Pelosi's office, and talking to gallery staff. And there's still the mist of all the bear sprays and the pepper sprays are still kind of in the air. There's debris everywhere. there wasn't a lot of damage to, to statues or paintings or anything of a historic nature, but you could certainly tell that there had been a rampage through this building, and Pelosi's her nameplate had been ripped off of the wall. So that might have been the first time that I understood the extent of it. And the gallery staffer who I was talking to, we were just looking at all the various law enforcement officers who were there, and they must have represented every branch of law enforcement that you could name. There was FBI, there were DOJ guys, there were Secret Service guys, there were Capitol Police, there were Metro Police, and even at that point, even at that early hour, they had already gone to the gallery and were taking the videos. So the investigation started then. I mean, it started immediately, and I think that was probably the first time you really understood that this was something very unique and very sad. The Capitol Police finally sent their email at 1:22 or something like that, that it was all clear. So once it was all clear, then they could gather again, and they made it a point. Everybody made it a point. Pelosi wanted to do it. Pence wanted to do it. McConnell wanted to do it. All the leaders said, we can't let these protesters win. We have to show them that we're stronger than that. So I think there were a lot of rank and file members who did not want to come back. I mean, everybody was shaken up. There's just no doubt about it. But they all eventually agreed that we've got to do this thing. We've got to get it done tonight. And so then we went back up to the gallery, and of course, once you're up there, you can see the broken window, where that footage, you've seen those pictures of the flagpole coming through that window, and the law enforcers with their guns already drawn. And so, then again, it's all sinking in as you're watching all of these things. You're seeing all the evidence, all the damage in real time. But then to have, they still have to vote, right? And so the expectation, I think, after that was, well, there's no way anybody would protest, knowing the ramifications of that, knowing what could happen. And of course, we know that they did. The 3 states went down to 2. They could only find 2 senators to back up the House protests. But you never got the sense that the House was ready to relinquish it. They still would have wanted 6, to have been challenged. They got 2. They got Arizona and Pennsylvania, and of course, the protests were defeated. And Jordan Carney and I, the Senate reporter, were walking home. I want to say it was about 4:30 in the morning that we were finally walking home. And it was just as peaceful as could be. There was almost no one on the street. You couldn't tell anything that had happened once you were outside of the perimeter. And that was, part of the surreality was the calmness of that morning, of that early morning. And then had to wake up, early the next day and come back because, Pelosi was already doing press conferences saying, we got to impeach the guy. So things were rolling very quickly, even then. But it was a late night, and looking back, when I went back to look at the pictures, whenever that was, I suppose I was looking at them that day or that night or the next day. And just pictures of some of the protesters, and zooming in, I was at a fairly far distance, but zooming in, you could see that a lot of them are wearing insignias. A lot of them are wearing, again, I don't want to say that it was militarized, but it was certainly organized. Like these were, as we're learning, more and more every day, this was a very well organized event, and these groups that look so disparate were actually, in many ways, colluding and working together, all with the same goal. And so just going back and zooming in on some of those pictures and seeing, again, these insignias that I can't decipher, but they're clearly a part of larger groups, and they were all, they all had the same thing in mind, and that was to turn on an election, and you just never thought that you would live to see that day. You thought that the institutions held, but they came close to not holding it. And I think that was the scariest part of it all, looking back on it. Having not experienced a violent threat directly, I can say that.